Some memories do not fade because they are forgotten. They wait because they are still keeping a promise. The retired police K-9 adoption fair stretched across the grassy county park just outside Virginia Beach beneath a sky painted with soft autumn blue, where rows of white tints fluttered gently in the ocean breeze and families wandered from kennel to kennel searching for companions who deserved another chance. The scent of fresh pine mulch mixed with salt drifting inland from the Atlantic, while children laughed between colorful banners honoring retired working dogs. Every kennel seemed filled with hopeful voices except the last one standing quietly beneath an old maple tree. Inside rested an elderly German shepherd whose dark sable coat had faded with time, silver spreading gently across his muzzle like early winter frost. His amber eyes never begged for attention. They simply watched the passing crowd with quiet patience, carrying the calm dignity of a soul that had spent a lifetime serving others. 8-year-old Chloe Parker stopped walking before anyone else noticed him. She tugged softly on her father's sleeve and pointed toward the lonely shepherd. "Daddy, can we please take that police dog home?" she asked with the simple hope only a child could carry. Her father smiled kindly and glanced toward the old dog. "Sweetheart, retired working dogs sometimes need very special families." Chloe never looked away. Maybe he has already been waiting for one. Her gentle words drifted across the afternoon air until they reached a man standing several yards away beside a display honoring military working dogs. Lucas Bennett had come only because an old friend from the Veterans Center suggested he stop by. At 39 years old, the former Navy SEAL had learned how to live with silence better than with conversation. He wore a weathered olive field jacket over a charcoal shirt, faded blue jeans, and worn leather boots that had crossed countless miles without ever feeling completely at home again. The years had etched quiet lines across his pale face, but nothing weighed heavier than the memories hidden behind his calm gray-blue eyes. He turned toward the little girl's voice almost absent-mindedly. Then he saw the old German shepherd slowly rise from the kennel floor. The dog did not bark. He did not wag his tail wildly or press against the fence. He simply stood with steady confidence and looked directly into Lucas's eyes, as though recognizing someone whose face had never disappeared from memory. As the shepherd stepped closer, a weathered brass tag hanging from his faded leather collar caught a narrow beam of afternoon sunlight. The tiny reflection flashed once before settling against his chest. Lucas's breathing stopped. His eyes fixed on the lower corner of the tag where an almost invisible crooked star had been scratched into the metal many years earlier. No official engraving machine had made that mark. No police department would have noticed it. Long ago, during a quiet evening after training, Lucas had carved that tiny star himself with the point of a pocket knife while laughing beside the teammate he trusted more than anyone else. It had been nothing more than a private joke shared between two friends and one young German shepherd. No one else should have known it existed. The sounds of the adoption fair faded into silence. Children still laughed somewhere beyond the tents. Flags still fluttered above the crowd. Yet everything around Lucas seemed impossibly distant. The elderly shepherd remained completely still, his warm amber eyes never leaving Lucas's face. There was no confusion in them, only peaceful recognition, as though every passing year had been nothing more than another mile walked toward this single moment. Chloe looked from the silent stranger to the waiting dog before quietly asking, "Daddy, why does that man look like he has just found someone he thought was gone forever?" Lucas could not answer, because standing only a few feet away was a German shepherd wearing a forgotten promise around his neck, and somehow the past had just looked back at him. Lucas Bennett remained frozen beside the display of retired working dog equipment while the voices around him faded into little more than distant echoes carried by the autumn breeze. The elderly German shepherd stood quietly behind the kennel gate, never barking, never pulling at the chain, simply watching him with patient amber eyes that held neither fear nor excitement. They held recognition. Lucas slowly stepped closer until only the weathered metal fence separated them. The faded leather collar rested gently against the shepherd's thick neck, and the worn brass tag swayed softly each time the wind passed through the open fairgrounds. His hand lifted almost without thinking, stopping only inches from the tag, as though touching it might erase the impossible moment unfolding before him. A volunteer wearing a navy blue jacket embroidered with the county retired K 9 Foundation noticed the expression on Lucas's face and approached quietly. "Do you know him?" she asked with gentle concern. Lucas swallowed before answering. "I do not know how that could be possible." The volunteer glanced toward the old shepherd. "His records are incomplete. He arrived from another department after retirement, but everything before that is almost missing. The only thing he never lets anyone remove is that collar." Lucas lowered his eyes toward the tiny crooked star scratched into the corner of the brass tag. The memory returned with startling clarity. A cool morning beside an isolated training field. Fresh coffee steaming from metal mugs. His closest teammate laughing while a young German shepherd chased a worn canvas bumper across the grass with endless enthusiasm. After training, Lucas had pulled out a pocket knife and carved that tiny crooked star into the edge of the tag, so they could always recognize it if the engraving faded with time. It had never been official. It had never been important. It had simply belonged to 3 friends who believed they had years ahead of them. Lucas had carried the weight of losing that life ever since leaving the Navy SEALs. At 39, he lived quietly outside Virginia Beach, repairing fences for neighbors, volunteering twice each week at a veterans center, and spending long evenings on his front porch where silence often felt louder than conversation. Friends admired his discipline and calm nature, but very few understood how often old memories returned whenever he heard a distant police siren or caught sight of a working dog riding beside an officer. He had learned to continue living, but he had never truly learned to let go. The old German shepherd slowly stepped forward until his nose rested gently against the fence. Lucas finally reached through the opening and allowed his hand to touch the coarse fur beneath the dog's jaw. Warmth met his fingertips immediately. The shepherd closed his eyes for a single peaceful moment before leaning ever so slightly into the familiar touch. Lucas felt his chest tighten. That quiet gesture was exactly the same one the young dog had always offered before every training exercise years ago. Chloe Parker watched from beside her father, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Daddy, he already trusts that man." Her father nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes trust survives longer than time. Lucas looked once more at the faded brass tag before carefully turning it over. Most of the engraving had nearly disappeared beneath years of service, yet one line remained faintly visible beneath the scratches. Operation Harbor Echo. His heartbeat stumbled. That operation had never existed outside a handful of classified records and the memories of those who had lived through it. The old German shepherd quietly held Lucas's gaze as though waiting for him to remember what came next, and somewhere beneath the weight of 12 silent years, Lucas realized the impossible truth. This faithful old dog had not been waiting for another family. He had been waiting for him. The old German shepherd never looked away. His amber eyes remained fixed on Lucas Bennett with a quiet certainty that seemed untouched by the passing years, while the breeze carried the scent of salt, fallen leaves, and fresh grass across the nearly silent fairgrounds. Families continued walking between the rows of kennels, children laughed in the distance, and volunteers welcomed visitors with warm smiles. Yet Lucas heard almost none of it. His attention remained locked on the faded brass tag resting against the shepherd's chest. The volunteer carefully unlatched the kennel gate so the elderly dog could stretch his legs. Instead of wandering toward the nearest family or sniffing the busy walkway, the German shepherd stepped calmly out of the kennel and stopped directly in front of Lucas. He lifted his nose just enough to gently touch Lucas's hand before standing perfectly still. There was no excitement, no nervousness, only the quiet confidence of a partner greeting someone he had trusted long ago. Lucas slowly knelt until they were face to face. His fingers moved carefully across the weathered leather collar, tracing every crack formed by time before gently turning the brass tag over once more. The faint engraving beneath the scratches remained almost impossible to read, but the words Operation Harbor Echo stood just clear enough to awaken another memory buried beneath years of silence. He remembered a cold morning wrapped in ocean fog, standing beside his closest teammate, while a young German shepherd waited patiently between them, ears raised, eyes bright, ready for another day of training. His teammate had smiled and said, "No matter what happens, he always remembers the way back." Lucas had laughed then, believing some promises would never need to be tested. The volunteer quietly handed Lucas a thin folder containing the shepherd's available records. He opened it carefully, expecting answers, but found only scattered veterinary reports, transfer forms, and retirement documents from different years. Entire sections were missing. The earliest pages had clearly been removed long ago, leaving only empty spaces where the beginning of the dog's story should have been. Lucas frowned thoughtfully. Someone had deliberately erased the years before the shepherd entered civilian service. Chloe Parker stepped closer, looking curiously at the folder before returning her attention to the old dog. Maybe somebody wanted people to forget, she whispered softly. Lucas looked at her with quiet surprise. Children often notice truths adults overlooked. Before he could answer, the German shepherd slowly turned away from the crowd and faced a narrow gravel path disappearing beyond the edge of the fairgrounds. He remained there for several seconds before looking back at Lucas, then toward the path again. The movement was small, deliberate, and unmistakable. Lucas recognized it immediately. During countless training exercises, working dogs had used exactly that signal whenever they located something important and wanted their handler to follow without unnecessary commands. This was not wandering. It was guidance. The elderly shepherd began walking at an unhurried pace beneath the shade of tall oak trees lining the edge of the property. Every few yards, he paused briefly to make certain Lucas remained behind him before continuing forward. Chloe watched with wide eyes. "He wants you to come," she said quietly. Lucas rose without hesitation. Deep inside, instincts he believed had disappeared years ago awakened once again with remarkable clarity. The gravel path curved gently toward an older section of county property where abandoned training buildings stood beyond weathered fences and overgrown grass. As golden afternoon light filtered through the branches overhead, Lucas realized he was no longer following an old dog searching for familiar ground. He was following a faithful partner who still remembered a mission that had never truly ended. The gravel path narrowed beneath towering oak trees whose branches filtered the late afternoon sunlight into long ribbons of gold stretching across the ground. Lucas Bennett walked several steps behind the elderly German shepherd while Chloe Parker and her father followed quietly, careful not to disturb the strange rhythm unfolding before them. Sentinel never hesitated. Every movement appeared deliberate, measured, and filled with quiet purpose. He paused only long enough to glance back at Lucas before continuing forward, just as he had done years earlier whenever he wanted his handler to stay close without speaking a single command. The familiar gesture awakened another forgotten memory inside Lucas. During countless training exercises, Sentinel had always looked back exactly once before leading the way. It had never meant uncertainty. It had always meant trust. The abandoned section of the county property slowly emerged beyond the trees. Rusted chain fences surrounded weathered training fields where tall grass now swayed freely in the coastal breeze. Wooden obstacles leaned gently with age, their faded paint slowly disappearing beneath years of rain and sunlight. A weathered sign near the entrance still carried the barely visible words "Former K-9 Training Facility." Nature had quietly reclaimed almost everything, yet the old German shepherd walked through the open gate with complete confidence, as though every stone and every path still lived clearly inside his memory. Lucas followed without question. Sentinel ignored the empty exercise yards and the abandoned kennels. Instead, he continued toward the smallest maintenance building standing alone beneath two aging maple trees whose crimson leaves drifted softly across the cracked concrete. The windows had been covered years earlier with faded blue shutters, one of which now hung slightly crooked against the weathered wall. Sentinel stopped beside that window and quietly sat down. He neither barked nor scratched the wood. He simply lifted his eyes toward Lucas before shifting his gaze to the loose shutter. Chloe noticed the movement immediately. "He wants you to look there," she whispered. Lucas slowly stepped forward. His fingertips brushed aside a curtain of ivy before carefully pulling the crooked shutter away from the wall. Behind it, hidden beneath layers of dust and old spider webs, a small brass hook remained firmly attached to the wooden frame. Hanging from the hook was an old iron key fastened to a cracked leather strap darkened by time. Lucas carefully lifted it into the fading sunlight. His heart began to race again. Burned into the end of the leather strip was the same tiny crooked star carved into Sentinel's brass tag years before. No one else would have recognized its meaning. Yet Lucas knew instantly that this could not have been coincidence. Someone had intentionally left the key for the one person capable of recognizing the mark. As Lucas quietly turned the heavy key between his fingers, the sound of slow footsteps echoed behind them. An elderly grounds supervisor emerged from another building carrying a ring of maintenance keys. He looked toward the weathered maintenance shed, then toward Lucas and Sentinel, his expression shifting from curiosity to quiet surprise. "I have worked here for almost 15 years, the man said softly. "No one has ever asked about that building. An older administrator told me years ago that if anyone ever found the hidden key with the little star, I was supposed to let them enter without asking questions." Lucas felt the cool metal grow heavier inside his hand. Sentinel slowly rose and walked toward the narrow wooden door at the side of the building before stopping beside the rusted lock. He looked back one final time, his calm amber eyes carrying the quiet certainty of a faithful partner who had finally reached the place where the next piece of the promise had been waiting all along. Lucas Bennett stood silently before the weathered wooden door while the old iron key rested in his palm, its cool weight somehow carrying far more than metal should. Sentinel waited patiently beside the rusted lock, his silvered muzzle lifted toward Lucas with the same calm confidence he had shown throughout the entire journey. There was no urgency in the elderly German shepherd's posture. Whatever had been waiting behind that door had already waited many years. It could wait another heartbeat. Lucas slowly inserted the key into the old brass lock. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft metallic click, the mechanism turned as smoothly as though someone had carefully maintained it through the passing years. The heavy wooden door opened inward, releasing a cool breath of air scented with cedar, aged paper, and machine oil preserved inside the quiet darkness. Narrow beams of golden evening light slipped through dusty windows, illuminating thousands of tiny floating particles that drifted peacefully across the room, like forgotten memories finally returning home. The elderly grounds supervisor remained respectfully outside. "Everything inside has been left exactly as it was," he said quietly. "That was the only instruction we ever received." Lucas nodded gratefully before stepping inside. Sentinel entered without hesitation. He ignored dusty filing cabinets, faded training manuals, empty shelves, and neatly stacked boxes that time had quietly covered with a fine layer of dust. Instead, he walked directly toward the far corner beneath an old wooden workbench where a dark green military footlocker rested against the wall. The elderly shepherd gently placed one weathered paw upon the lid before looking back at Lucas. It was the same signal he had used years earlier whenever he discovered something important during training exercises. Lucas slowly knelt beside the footlocker. Across the front, barely visible beneath years of dust, someone had carefully written a single word with faded black marker. Bennett. His heartbeat quickened. It was not an inventory label. It was a destination. Someone had expected this footlocker to reach him one day. Lucas carefully released the metal latch and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, everything had been arranged with remarkable care, untouched by time. A folded American flag rested neatly across the top, protected by clean white cloth. Beneath it lay a waterproof journal, a small protective case containing a digital memory card, a polished navy insignia wrapped in soft fabric, several carefully preserved photographs, and a cream-colored envelope bearing only 2 handwritten words. For Lucas. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the envelope. The handwriting instantly awakened another quiet memory. He had seen those steady letters countless times on handwritten notes left beside morning coffee, on equipment checklists, and inside birthday cards shared among teammates who believed friendship deserved to be celebrated even during difficult seasons. Chloe Parker stood quietly beside the doorway, understanding without anyone telling her that some moments belonged entirely to another person's heart. Sentinel slowly lowered himself beside Lucas and rested his head gently against Lucas's knee. The old German shepherd closed his eyes for a peaceful moment, as though satisfied that he had successfully completed the final step of an assignment carried faithfully across many silent years. Lucas carefully opened the envelope, but paused before unfolding the letter inside. Beneath it rested one final object that immediately drew a quiet smile across his face. It was an old canvas training bumper, faded almost white from countless days spent crossing grassy fields. Sentinel gently touched the familiar bumper with his nose before looking up at Lucas once more. The memory returned instantly. His closest teammate had always laughed and said that every training day should end with one final retrieve because a loyal partner deserved to finish with joy instead of duty. Looking around the peaceful room, Lucas finally understood that nothing inside the footlocker had been preserved merely to protect old belongings. Every carefully arranged item had been waiting for this exact evening, when a faithful German shepherd could finally place the last forgotten promise back into the hands of the friend it had always belonged to. Lucas Bennett carefully unfolded the letter while the quiet room remained wrapped in the golden light of early evening. Sentinel rested peacefully beside him, his weathered head leaning gently against Lucas's leg as though he had waited years for this single moment. The paper had yellowed with time, but the handwriting remained clear and steady. Lucas recognized every stroke before reading the first sentence. It belonged to the teammate whose voice had never truly disappeared from his memories. He took a slow breath and began reading. Dear Lucas, if these words have finally reached you, then our faithful partner has completed the last assignment I ever trusted him to carry. Before you continue reading, there is something you must promise me. Stop blaming yourself. You have carried a burden that was never yours alone. For years you will probably believe that you lost both a teammate and a dog. The truth is very different. I asked you to leave because someone had to survive with hope still intact. Sentinel refused to leave my side afterward. He made that choice on his own because loyalty was never something anyone could command from him. When I realized I could not change his mind, I gave him one final mission instead. Protect the truth until Lucas is ready to hear it. Dogs never measure time the way people do. They measure trust. And if Sentinel has led you here today, then he never forgot either of us. Lucas stopped reading as his vision blurred. For more than a decade, he had replayed the final days of his military service countless times, always believing that one different decision might have changed everything. Yet the words resting quietly in his hands carried no blame, no bitterness, and no regret. They carried forgiveness long before he had learned to ask for it. Sentinel slowly lifted his head and looked into Lucas's eyes with the same calm expression he had worn since the adoption fair. Without a sound, the elderly German shepherd placed one weathered paw across Lucas's boot exactly as he had done before every difficult training exercise years earlier. It was never a command. It was always reassurance. Chloe Parker remained respectfully near the doorway, sensing that some moments deserved silence instead of questions. Lucas reached deeper into the footlocker and carefully lifted the waterproof journal resting beneath the folded flag. Unlike an official mission log, every page was filled with ordinary memories. Morning coffee before sunrise. Long walks beside the shoreline after training. Sentinel proudly carrying the old canvas bumper back one final time before every day ended. Handwritten notes about birthdays, shared jokes, quiet conversations, and simple evenings when friendship mattered more than achievement. Tucked between the final pages rested a photograph showing 3 smiling companions standing together beneath a clear blue sky, with a young sentinel sitting proudly between them while both men rested a hand upon his shoulders. Lucas smiled through tears that no longer belonged only to sorrow. He had spent years remembering the ending while forgetting the countless peaceful days that had made the journey worth living in the first place. Sentinel leaned gently against him once more, his breathing slow and steady, as though the faithful old dog understood that the heaviest weight had finally been lifted. Outside, the evening breeze stirred the maple leaves beyond the dusty windows, carrying soft light across the forgotten room where silence no longer felt lonely. Lucas carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope before resting one grateful hand upon Sentinel's silvered head. In that quiet moment, he realized the greatest gift waiting inside the footlocker had never been the journal, the keepsakes, or even the treasured memories. It was the freedom to forgive himself, lovingly protected across many silent years by a loyal German shepherd who had never stopped believing that one faithful promise would someday lead his partner home. The quiet room seemed even smaller after Lucas Bennett folded the letter and placed it gently back inside the envelope. Outside, the last rays of sunlight slipped through the branches of the old maple trees, painting long golden lines across the dusty wooden floor, while the evening breeze carried the distant sound of leaves rustling beyond the forgotten training yard. Sentinel remained close, his weathered body resting beside Lucas with the peaceful confidence of a companion who no longer needed to search for anything. The faithful German Shepherd had completed the final mission entrusted to him years before, yet he never appeared proud of what he had accomplished. He simply looked content that the truth had finally reached the one heart meant to receive it. Chloe Parker quietly stepped farther into the room, careful not to disturb the silence that surrounded Lucas. She looked at the open footlocker, then at the old photographs resting neatly inside. "May I see them?" she asked softly. Lucas nodded with a gentle smile and handed her the small stack. Chloe studied each picture with the careful attention only children sometimes give to ordinary moments. There were no dramatic scenes, no ceremonies, no grand celebrations. One photograph showed two young friends sitting on the tailgate of a pickup truck sharing sandwiches, while Sentinel rested between them with his head across their boots. Another captured the three of them walking along a quiet stretch of beach at sunrise, coffee mugs in hand, with the young German Shepherd proudly carrying the faded canvas bumper instead of dropping it into the sand. The final picture showed Sentinel asleep beside a campfire while both men quietly watched the stars without speaking. Chloe smiled. "They all look happy." Lucas looked at the photographs again, and for the first time in many years he saw them without the shadow of what came later. "They were," he answered. "I forgot that for a long time." The elderly grounds supervisor quietly entered the doorway, removing his cap before speaking. "I knew the administrator who left instructions about this building," he said. "He told me there might come a day when a retired military man and an old shepherd would walk through that door together. He never explained why. He only said I would know when it happened." Lucas thanked him with quiet sincerity. The man smiled warmly before leaving them alone again, gently closing the door behind him. Sentinel slowly stood and walked toward the glowing laptop still resting on the workbench. Lucas inserted the memory card into the reader with careful hands. After a brief pause, a collection of short home videos appeared on the screen. The first clip showed Sentinel racing across a grassy field before joyfully returning the old training bumper to Lucas while his teammate laughed behind the camera. Another clip captured a rainy afternoon beneath a shelter where all three shared quiet moments, drying the young dog's fur with worn towels while coffee steamed nearby. The final recording lasted only a few seconds. Lucas's teammate looked directly into the camera, smiling with the calm confidence Lucas remembered so well. He gently rested one hand upon Sentinel's shoulder before speaking. "If you are watching this, old friend, then our stubborn partner did exactly what I believed he would do. Do not spend another day carrying yesterday. Live well. Laugh again. Take him home." The recording ended, leaving only silence inside the room. Lucas lowered his head as tears quietly filled his eyes, but this time they carried gratitude instead of grief. Sentinel walked to his side and rested his silvered muzzle against Lucas's shoulder, offering comfort without asking for anything in return. Lucas wrapped one arm gently around the old German shepherd's neck and closed his eyes. The burden that had followed him across countless mornings and lonely evenings no longer felt impossible to carry because it had finally been replaced by something stronger. Peace had arrived not through extraordinary heroics, but through the quiet faithfulness of one remarkable dog who never forgot where home truly was, and through the enduring love of a friend who believed that forgiveness was the final gift worth protecting. The drive back to Lucas Bennett's small home unfolded beneath a sky glowing with soft shades of amber and deep blue as autumn settled quietly across the countryside outside Virginia Beach. Sentinel rested peacefully in the back seat of the pickup truck upon the old blanket Lucas had spread there before leaving the adoption fair that morning. The elderly German shepherd no longer watched every passing mile with the alert focus of a working dog. Instead, his head rested comfortably against the window while the fading sunlight reflected gently across the weathered brass tag hanging from his worn leather collar. Lucas glanced into the rearview mirror from time to time, smiling each time he saw the old shepherd sleeping without worry. It was the first peaceful rest he imagined Sentinel had enjoyed in many years. Chloe Parker waved goodbye as her father turned toward their own truck, but before leaving she hurried back one last time and gently hugged Sentinel around the neck. "I will come visit you soon," she whispered. The old German shepherd answered with one slow sweep of his tail before quietly climbing back into the truck. Lucas drove the final miles home surrounded not by silence alone, but by a quiet sense of gratitude that had slowly replaced the weight he had carried for so long. When they arrived, the small wooden house looked exactly as it always had, tucked beneath tall maple trees whose golden leaves drifted lazily across the front yard. Yet somehow everything appeared different. The front porch no longer felt empty. The cool evening air no longer carried loneliness. Lucas opened the passenger side of the truck and waited patiently while Sentinel stepped down onto the gravel driveway. The elderly shepherd paused for a moment, lifting his nose toward the gentle breeze carrying the scent of cedar, fresh earth, and distant salt from the Atlantic. Then he looked toward Lucas before walking calmly beside him to the porch without needing a single spoken command. Inside the house, Lucas carefully arranged the treasured keepsakes upon the dining table. The folded American flag rested beside the waterproof journal, the old photographs, the Navy insignia, the memory card, and the letter that had quietly changed everything. He placed the weathered brass tag beside them for only a brief moment before gently fastening it once again around Sentinel's neck. Some things belonged in a place of honor. Others belonged exactly where they had always been. Sentinel slowly walked through every room of the house before returning to the living room, where he settled beside the fireplace with a deep, contented sigh. Lucas smiled as he watched the old shepherd close his eyes without tension for the first time. The faithful partner, who had spent years protecting another man's promise, no longer needed to remain on duty. The mission had ended. The burden had been shared. As darkness settled softly beyond the windows, Lucas prepared a simple evening meal before carrying a warm bowl of fresh water and a comfortable blanket to Sentinel's favorite corner beside the hearth. The old German shepherd lifted his head just long enough to meet Lucas's eyes before gently resting it again upon the folded blanket. There was quiet trust in that single glance, stronger than any spoken promise. Lucas sat nearby with the letter resting once more in his hands, reading every line slowly beneath the warm glow of the fireplace, while Sentinel slept peacefully only a few feet away. For years, Lucas had believed healing would arrive through answers. Instead, it had arrived through forgiveness, quiet companionship, and the faithful heart of a German shepherd who had never forgotten where he truly belonged. Outside, autumn leaves continued drifting gently across the porch, while inside the small house every corner seemed filled with something that had been missing for far too long. Home no longer felt like a place waiting to be found. It had quietly become one again. Several peaceful weeks slipped quietly into late autumn, and the small wooden home outside Virginia Beach slowly became a place where every sunrise carried comfort instead of regret. Golden maple leaves gathered across the front yard, their colors glowing beneath crisp morning light, while a cool breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar and distant salt through the open windows. Every morning, Lucas Bennett stepped onto the front porch with a warm cup of coffee before the first rays of sunlight reached the fields beyond his fence. Waiting beside the rocking chair was Sentinel. The elderly German shepherd had chosen the same place on the porch from the very first evening he arrived, stretching comfortably across the weathered wooden boards where he could watch the quiet road and the peaceful yard without ever needing to stand guard again. His breathing had become slower, calmer, and more restful than Lucas had seen since the day they reunited. The years still showed around the silver on his muzzle, but the quiet weight that once rested behind his amber eyes had finally disappeared. Chloe Parker visited nearly every Saturday afternoon with her father. She never came empty-handed. Sometimes she carried homemade dog biscuits shaped like little stars. Sometimes she brought a fresh tennis ball, even though Sentinel preferred his old canvas training bumper resting beside the porch steps. Most often, she simply brought a favorite storybook, sitting cross-legged beside the old shepherd while reading aloud beneath the warm autumn sunlight. Sentinel always rested his head gently across her shoes, listening with patient attention as though every page mattered. Lucas often watched them from the porch without saying a word, realizing that healing rarely arrived through extraordinary moments. More often, it appeared quietly inside ordinary afternoons, shared with people who simply chose to stay. Inside the living room, one corner of the house had become a place of quiet remembrance rather than sorrow. The folded American flag rested inside a handcrafted wooden display case beside the waterproof journal, the restored photographs, the Navy insignia, and the carefully preserved letter that had changed everything. Hanging above them, framed beneath soft glass, was the weathered brass tag with the tiny crooked star still visible despite the years. Lucas never tried to polish away the scratches. They were not imperfections. They were proof that loyalty could survive time without losing its meaning. One gentle afternoon after a brief autumn rain, sunlight broke through the clouds and filled the yard with a warm golden glow. Lucas picked up the faded canvas training bumper and tossed it only a few yards across the grass. Sentinel watched it land before standing slowly with quiet determination. He walked toward it at an easy pace, carefully lifted it between his teeth, and returned without rushing. When he gently placed it into Lucas's waiting hand, their eyes met for a long, peaceful moment that needed no words. Chloe smiled brightly. "He still remembers," she whispered. Lucas gently rested one hand upon Sentinel's silvered head. "The heart always remembers what truly matters," he answered softly. Sentinel leaned against his leg before settling peacefully beside the porch once more. The afternoon breeze stirred the maple branches overhead, while sunlight reflected gently from the little brass tag hanging inside the window. Lucas looked toward the quiet horizon and finally understood that the greatest legacies are never measured by medals, missions, or recognition. They are measured by promises faithfully kept, kindness quietly shared, and love that refuses to disappear even after many years. He smiled, lowered his hand to stroke Sentinel's weathered fur one last time that evening, and whispered with calm gratitude, "Welcome home, partner." The old German shepherd closed his eyes peacefully as the golden light settled across the porch, and in the gentle silence that followed, it felt as though every road they had ever traveled had always been leading them back to this one simple place called home.